You think it's boring, living on a space station? Well, you're a spacer. You need to be amongst the stars out in deep space, I understand that. Hell, I used to be like that. But as you get older, you don't have the energy you used to, and you start to see the value of a place to make your nest, so to speak. I like it here on Korea Trade Station. Work in the canteen is easy enough. I make sure the auto kitchen is stocked, and I check that the vending machines are all clean and working properly. Doesn't take me long, and the rest of the time I get to hang around spacers like you. You get people from all over the galaxy passing through here, species you've barely heard of. Sure, it's not quite the same as going out into the deep black yourself, but I've heard things sitting in this very chair that I never saw in all my decades on the freighters. So is it boring? Nah, it's like sitting right in the middle of the tree, where all the branches lead to. It's not as if I'm just living vicariously through other people's stories either. Things happen here. You put so many different species together, sooner rather than later, there's going to be something interesting happening. Were you here for the Tok wedding a couple of days ago? A spacer on one of their cargo ships went into heat unexpectedly, so they docked here and had to find the best husband they could from whoever was passing through. The bride's supposed to show she can build a decent nest, so they took over half the lobby of the hotel and hung it with every soft furnishing she had on the ship. They like to travel with all their worldly possessions, so that was a sight, let me tell you. And then the auction started. Personally, I wouldn't call a bidding war very romantic, but then, I'm not a Tok. Given that most of them had never set eyes on her before, they got pretty competitive about it. Imagine 100 fur-covered serpents hissing and snipping at each other, while at the same time trying to catch the auctioneer's eye. Of course, with her father not around, it was the captain of the cargo ship running the auction, and he had to use a shock baton to keep the crowd back. Then all the losers flooded the canteen and emptied out our supply of cocoa root. Security had to use the cleaning bots to shovel them out of here in the morning. What about the human? Oh, you heard about that, did you? Yeah, we had one of those. He came in on one of the Tok ships. If you heard he was here, you probably heard he caused all kinds of trouble. Yeah, I thought you might have. Well, you know what spacers are like with rumors. It's a long time out in the black, and they've got to have something to keep themselves occupied from port to port. If there was a malfunction in the auto kitchen here and food service stopped for an hour, by the time the story got to Anagia Station, we'd have suffered through a month-long famine and been scraping toilet waste out of the pipes to survive. Okay, so there was an incident, but it's not like the human stepped off the ship and immediately went berserk. In fact, I don't think most of Korea Station would have noticed he was here. He kept his head down, didn't go out of his way to interact with anyone. It was just bad luck that a Kalu-Kamzku ship docked at the same time. Don't get many Kamzku passing through here. It's not the most comfortable environment for them. Lights are too bright, gravity's too high, oxygen's a bit low. And they don't do well around other species. They're semi-telepathic. They have verbal and gestural cues, but a lot of their language, if you can call it that, is them constantly sending messages subconsciously via pheromones. So it's bewildering for them trying to deal with sentience whose thoughts aren't broadcast automatically. In fact, they find it pretty difficult to conceptualize sentience in other species at all. It's just weird for them, like if this table started talking. When they come onto a station full of aliens, they usually come in groups where one senior guy who's been specially trained does all the talking. So really, the first disturbance was 6 of them marching through the concourse. Kalu-Kamzku are big, like low-grav species usually are, and they don't take too much notice of where they're stepping. 5 meters long, they take up a lot of space, and the only reason they didn't plow through the crowds was because they've got long legs, and they hold themselves about 2 meters off the ground. More than a few spacers got a nasty shock when a shadow passed over them and they looked up to see a Kalu-Kamzku right above, totally oblivious to them. Of course, a lot of the visitors here are Amiya just like us, and you know how we are about shadows passing overhead. If you were watching the concourse as the Kamzku came through, you'd think a flock of Kaya pigeons had been startled by a geohawk. And just my luck, the Kamzku were heading straight for the canteen, which is very definitely not designed to seat one individual that big, let alone 6 of them. They aren't the first plus-size species who've ever come through Korea Station, of course. So we had an area set aside for them just outside the main dining hall. But of course, being Kamzku, they didn't pay any attention to the signage, which meant I had to be the one to tell them to wait outside. Now I've spent plenty of time out in deep space, where there's a lot that can go wrong and not a lot of help if it does. So I wouldn't say I'm a particularly timid individual. However, I did not like the idea of trying to stop something as big as a Kalu-Kamzku from going where it wanted to go. Unfortunately for me, though, it's my job to make sure the canteen's rules are followed. Believe me, I thought about taking an impromptu leave of absence, but someone has to look after this place and, well, they wouldn't actually try to hurt me, right? So just as the leader was trying to duck through the doorway, I flew right up to his face, because the only way he was going to stop was if I was physically blocking his path, and asked him nicely to wait in the designated area. He looked at me. They have 4 large compound eyes on either side of their head, but I could tell he was looking at me and trying to work out what was going on. Then the little translator box around his neck buzzed. "No, we are hungry. We will go inside and eat food there. That's the Kalu-Kamzku for you. Once they set their minds on an idea, they don't let go of it." And although this one at least seemed to understand what I was saying, it was clear that it didn't carry much weight with him. He may have thought I was just making a suggestion. Their pheromones carry emotional cues, so without them, they have immense trouble working out whether someone is offering a piece of casual advice or in an apoplectic rage. Their written language is convoluted, to say the least. Try reading Kamzku literature sometime. You'll get a sentence like, "I wish death upon your family," followed by, "This was conveyed with great anger." So somehow I had to get across to them that they had to wait outside without the necessary glands to spray it chemically into their faces. I tried to be as blunt as possible, told them, "Station policy prohibits individuals longer than 3 meters from entering the canteen." All I got in return was, "That is not our policy. We are hungry. We will eat inside." Having restated its position, the lead Kalu-Kamzku started trying to enter the canteen again. At this point, there was a building queue of patrons who now couldn't get out because the Kamzku were blocking the doors. It was tempting just to let the Kamzku have their way and at least let people in and out again. But the dining hall was just too small. They'd cause chaos, bumping into things and stepping in people's lunch. So I flew right up to the leader's face and one last time tried to tell him to wait in the designated area. He just swatted me away with his foreclaw. Well, swatted is a bit overdramatic. Firmly pushed me aside, maybe a better way of putting it. Still, the Kalu-Kamzku foreclaw is a vicious-looking thing, a meter-long hooked claw with serrations. Most of the time, they keep it hinged up out of the way so they can use the manipulator claws at its base, but this guy had his locked in forward position, and for a moment I thought he was going to skewer me. Of course, Kalu-Kamzku don't really get violent. The claws are for stripping away tree bark, and they rarely fight amongst themselves. But he could have seriously hurt me just by accident. That was when the human stepped forward. I'd noticed him come in earlier and kept an eye on him for a bit, but all he was doing was pondering the vending machines, so I got distracted by something else and forgot about him. Whatever he'd found in the vending machines that he could eat, he must have finished it and been heading for the exit just as the Kalu-Kamzku came in. Talk about bad luck, right? It's been a couple of decades since their first disastrous encounter, but the humans and the Kalu-Kamzku still aren't exactly comfortable around each other. You ever see any of the vids from the human-Kamzku conflict? They'll give you nightmares for weeks. I'm a canteen supervisor, and I thought I was about to have a major diplomatic incident on my hands. Not to mention the cleaning bots aren't designed to deal with entrails. But the human didn't immediately charge in. And when the lead Kalu-Kamzku saw the human, well, that definitely made him stop. For a moment, everyone was quiet. And I mean the whole canteen. There were 50 individuals from maybe half a dozen species, and suddenly all eyes were on the front, and no one so much as breathing heavily. Anyone who didn't recognize the human had it quickly whispered to them by their neighbors. Everyone was waiting for the fight to start. The human, however, didn't jump into a homicidal rampage. Instead, he quite politely explained to the Kalu-Kamzku that they were disturbing people who were trying to eat here, and they were also blocking the door. The lead Kamzku pointed both its foreclaws at the human and jabbed as if it was going to stab him. The human didn't even flinch as the claws stopped half a meter from him. The Kamzku tried to shoo the human out of the way a second time, and it didn't work any better. Then the human started walking forward, and the Kamzku's legs started scrabbling as it tried to back up out of the doorway, which caused the Kamzku behind him to start scrabbling too, trying to back up out of his way. Would have been funny if I wasn't so terrified. The human just kept walking forward until they were all outside the canteen. The Kalu-Kamzku leader, confronted by a human walking implacably towards it, reared up on its back legs. Must have been 4-5 meters tall, and it spread its forelimbs out. Standing next to the human, it was massive. I was worried it was gearing up to taking a swipe at him with those foreclaws, so I flew over in the hope that I might be able to defuse things before blood was spilt. No need. The Kamzku held its posture, and the human just stepped forward again. The Kamzku apparently hadn't been prepared for this because it jerked back, almost tripping over its own legs. The human just stood there, and then he said, "I think you should wait outside." The Kamzku paused for a moment. Then the leader turned to me and said, "We will wait outside," and that's really all there is to tell. Of course, within minutes the rumor was going around the station that the Kamzku had attacked a human and the human had fought them off. But no, the Kalu-Kamzku went to the designated area like they'd been asked and waited until the delivery drone brought them their fungus. No further trouble from them at all. I did ask the human to stick around just in case, with the offer of anything he liked from the vending machines for free. I'll admit, I was slightly curious just to see what he'd eat. It's not like we stock prey animals here after all. But it turns out humans can eat a wide variety of things, not just meat. In fact, they're able to cope with a wider range of plant products than we are. You learn something new every day, right? I got to chatting with him, and it turned out this wasn't his first encounter with the Kalu-Kamzku. He'd fought in the First Contact War, as humans call it, way back when he was a young man. Frontline infantry. It had been a long time since he'd seen one, but he still had no trouble remembering how to deal with Kalu-Kamzku. He knew they weren't going to hurt him. Kalu-Kamzku, like any sane species, hate getting into a physical confrontation. Their first reaction is always to try and scare away the threat, and if that doesn't work, they'll back off. If their mission is to kill humans, they might attack first. But unless they've been given a specific task, they'll generally only fight when cornered. Personally, even with that knowledge, I wouldn't want to risk getting on the wrong end of those foreclaws. The human didn't seem bothered by it, though. It wasn't like they were very good at fighting anyway, he said. Too slow and not nearly as strong as they look. Gravity on Kuria Station is calibrated for Amia, which means it's about a third heavier than the Kalu-Kamzku are used to, but it's still 15% below what humans evolved in. If the Kamzku leader had actually tried to use his foreclaws, the human was quick enough to dodge any jab, and strong enough to grab hold and tear them right off. I didn't go into too much depth about how he knew this. We did talk about plenty of other things, however. His name was Carl Adams, and he'd led a pretty interesting life. Born on Earth, but grew up mostly in the outlying colonies on the fringe of humanity's sphere of settlement. He'd learned a lot about wilderness survival on newly terraformed planets, and he'd had to help out around the colony in between schooling because there were too many jobs to be done and not enough people to do them. Then, when the Kalu-Kamzku attacked, he'd signed up right away to defend humanity from the alien threat. After the war ended, he'd gone back to Earth and worked private security for a while. Then he went into business with one of his security contracts selling farm equipment, using the knowledge he'd picked up reprogramming agri-drones as a kid. Then he'd started traveling around the more established worlds on behalf of a new colony looking for suitable settlers. But he'd always wanted to see what the galaxy was like beyond human space. After the peace treaty with the Kalu-Kamzku, humans started to get a few alien visitors, but it was still rare for human ships to go out into the wider galaxy. So he decided to take the initiative and negotiated passage with a Talk crew, who are always open to trying new things if they get a good deal out of it. First out to the trade hub at Maripo, then he caught a ride with an Ifaski cargo ship to the science station at Vogue. Then he managed to convince an Amia science vessel to take him to Akoka, where he found the Tok cargo ship that brought him here. He called this hitchhiking. He'd had plenty of adventures along the way, by the sound of it. He almost lost everything he had gambling at Maripo with some talk, then got arrested, just for being human, as far as he could work out, then ended up being released into the care of an Upau Rokvau for some reason, who tried to teach him Upau Rokvau poetry, as well as showing him how to negotiate with the Afaski, which is always a tricky business. And that was just the first 2 weeks. He'd been traveling for 8 months, and he'd already had more adventure than most people have in a lifetime. I tried to press Adams for more stories, but he said I'd just have to wait for his book. He wasn't just hitchhiking around the galaxy for his own amusement. He was writing a guide for any other humans who wanted to do the same, in honor of a famous ancestor, apparently, who had the idea before humans even left their home system. Humans, I tell you, there isn't a species in the galaxy that's more full of surprises. Adams stayed a few more days, and we got on pretty well while he was here. He promised to pay a visit if he was ever passing through here again, and he also promised to send me a copy of his book when it was done. Oh, and he gave me a couple of good tips on dealing with Kalu-Kamzku as well. So is life on a space station boring? Never, but even less so from now on, I reckon. Because I think Adams is just the first. This whole hitchhiking thing is going to be a big thing soon. Mark my words. And when humans regularly start making it this far, everything is going to get a whole lot more interesting.
If you're a fan of WRickWrites, the author of this story, he now has his own YouTube channel full of many more sci-fi stories. You'll find his channel link in the description. Please head on over and subscribe to his channel.